Hello, welcome to the programme. Today we're talking about Ukrainian political prisoners being held captive in Russia. Now, just recently a rally was held to commemorate the anniversary of the illegal arrest 4 years ago of movie director Oleh Sentsov and activist Aleksandr Kolchenko in Russian-occupied Crimea. Now, activists laid out a timeline of their ordeal on a huge paper roll recently, but holding rallies and other commemorative events is obviously not enough to get them freed. So what can be done to make the Kremlin release these political prisoners? Now, to talk about this, we're joined in the studio by Maksym Butkevych. He's the coordinator of the No Borders project. Mr. Butkevych, thank you very much for coming into our studio today.
Thank you for the invitation.
So, as we just saw on the video, it was a really great initiative to highlight the plight of Oleh Sentsov and Aleksandr Korchenko. So, how important and what sort of strategies are there to make sure that actually their captivity remains in the spotlight?
In the first place, I have to admit that 4 years after the arrests were made, it's more and more difficult to keep the cases in the spotlight because there are no news. And if there are no news, you don't have media coverage. So this is why, among other things, the Solidarity Committee initiative dedicated to support of Oleg and Alexander decided to make the street rally to draw attention to plight of Oleg and Alexander. And without media attention, it's very difficult to push, to motivate international organizations and politicians from other countries to keep up pressure upon Kremlin, because we see that only international solidarity campaign on very different level, from grassroots and civil society to political top, is the only thing which can move Kremlin to release political prisoners.
And how important is the Ukrainian civil society in influencing the Kremlin's decision? You said that you rely a lot on the international support as well, but what about, for example, the Ukrainian state and the human rights ombudsman and these sorts of other people? You know, what sort of role do they play, and how important is it in getting these prisoners like Oleh Sentsov and Kolchenko released?
We see that all these years, Ministry of Foreign Affairs tries to keep attention, keep it in the spotlight, but also to repeat demands that Ukrainian diplomats have access to Oleg and Alexander, demands which were all rejected by Russian officials. Ukrainian ombudsman, a previous one, was in touch with ombudsman of Russian Federation, trying to influence at least conditions Oleg and Alexander are held in. But we see that the civil society in Ukraine, at least, is more active, more let's say pushy, and plays a leading role, while the Ukrainian state rather follows the path.
I see. So the civil society is still, even 4 years after, is leading one of the major roles.
This is my subjective impression, but I'm part of civil society, so I don't want to compliment myself. But this is what I see usually on the ground.
And can you tell us a bit about how people like the Ukrainian ombudsman work with the Russian ombudsman to try and get these political prisoners released? Because it must be incredibly difficult.
It is.
What sort of strategies are there? I mean, is it really just negotiation, some form of dialogue, or how does the Ukrainian ombudsman have influence or can influence the Russian ombudsman?
When it comes to release, we have to keep in mind that this is not a legal issue, and these are not legal cases. These are purely political cases, which can be resolved, and prisoners can be released only upon very high top political level. We know the person who can decide to release Oleg Sentsov and Aleksandr Korchenko, and his name is Vladimir Putin. This is it. So Ukrainian ombudsman rather tries to react when it comes to health, threat to life of Ukrainian prisoners. When we received, or when Ukrainian organizations received reports that Aleksandr Kolchenko has been put to hospital due to weight loss. There was a demand from Ukrainian side that Russian ombudsman intervenes and proper medical care is provided to Oleksandr. Currently, we know that Oleh Sentsov and he serves his time in Arctic zone.
Far away from civilization.
In extremely dire climate conditions. From being a person from very southern part of Ukraine, from subtropical climate. He is basically put into the opposite conditions, and of course it affects his health. So proper medical care should be provided, and this is a question where Ukrainian ombudsman tries to have influence upon the Russian counterpart.
And for perhaps viewers who don't know so much about this case of Oleh Sentsov and Mr. Kolchenko, is it possible you could explain why Sentsov and Kolchenko are perhaps still being held, whilst other political prisoners, remember Nadia Savchenko was released, why they were released? So what sort of factors play into this? Is it really because the Kremlin wants to have a sort of a tool, really, I guess you could say, in its chessboard to use against Ukraine when it comes to negotiating? It
looks like that. Of course, I cannot say that I can understand the logic, who is released and who is not. For that, I should look inside Mr. Putin's head, which is not possible, fortunately. But in this Kafkian world of his, where he lives, we see that Oleh Sentsov and Aleksandr Korchenko were among the first arrested, and they were not only prisoners, they were the showcase. They were arrested in, just recently at the time, occupied Crimea, Crimean Peninsula, and they were shown as a model what will happen to anyone who shows discontent with the occupation. These harsh sentences, 20 and 10 years for Oleg and for Sasha, respectively, were a threat to anyone else who would dare to raise their voice against occupation. When the support campaign started, it became clear that they can be exchanged. This is why they're quite often called in Ukraine hostages. They are not even prisoners, they are hostages. They can be exchanged for probably some political decisions when it comes to sanctions, or some geopolitical steps, or maybe some Russian spies held in Ukraine or elsewhere. So it's kind of a, logic of slavery. They are objects which, and Putin prefers to manipulate them.
In a much broader political game.
Exactly. Yeah. On the other hand, we see this paradox with Oleh Sentsov and Aleksandr Kolchenko, specifically with Oleg, who is a very brave person, as we saw from his speeches during the trial. While in captivity, he turned out to be more dangerous to Putin than when he was at large, when he was free.
Yeah.
And this is why he's currently transferred in the most distant colony possible.
Because often these prisoners actually draw attention to their cause more in prison than they would have actually back in Crimea, you would have imagined.
Exactly, and this is what Oleg does.
Yeah. And can you tell me a bit about your organisation as well, No Borders, and what you seek to achieve ultimately?
No Borders project in a different form, with different forms, but exists for 12 years now. We are small non-governmental organizations, partly activist group, and we work mostly with three main areas. We try to support refugees and asylum seekers in Ukraine who try to seek asylum in Ukraine, fleeing from persecution in their home countries. Primarily, these are countries of former Soviet Union. We try to work and counteract when it comes to manifestations of xenophobia, racism, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination in Ukrainian society. And since beginning of occupation and war, we try to assist internally displaced persons. But of course, there are many other areas we are interested in, as freedom of expression and freedom of assemblies. And one of these issues, is support of Ukrainian political prisoners in Russia. So we helped to found this initiative, the Solidarity Committee, which is preoccupied with support of Oleh Sentsov and Aleksandr Kolchenko. Yeah,
and I have one final question for you. Actually, I read your Facebook page, and on May the 9th, you wrote a very interesting page. I can read it here. You said that over the past 4 years in your work, there had been, like a lot of doubt doubt, inspiration, fears, disappointments, and again, hope. I think it's really interesting for me and the viewers why you carry on with this work. What is the motivation for you to carry on and help these guys like Oleh Sentsov and Aleksandr Korchenko be freed from Russia?
No, Facebook post you've just quoted is part of social networks flash mob we launched. They're still there. We call upon different people to recall what happened to them in these 4 years while our prisoners are behind bars. And the answer to your question is, I frankly don't see any other way. If we don't keep up efforts, basically it will be defeat. We have to resist when it comes to that. We have to move forward. Currently, Ukraine is at a very turbulent period of its history, but this is a moment when we can do something nice, free, and great out of this country. If we fail, it will affect not only us, but generations to come. And this is quite a strong motivation for me.
Okay, well, I think many people would thank you for all the work that you do in not just helping the political prisoners, but other sort of minority communities in Ukraine. So thank you for coming into our studio today.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was Maksym Butkevych. He's the coordinator of the No Borders project. Thanks for watching UATV.